All right, now that we're here, let's have a little Bible study. I'd like to talk about some end time events and really focus on Revelation chapter 20 that talks about this 1,000-year period, the millennium. Prophecy, I do want to mention, is always second to the more important matters of the law, as Jesus says. Justice and mercy and faithfulness, and our ability to forgive one another and to love one another. This is what we should always have in the forefront of our mind, is our character development and our relationship with Christ and with his Father. And so with that said, prophecy is important. We have it gives us a good foothold. And Jesus himself, when he was talking to the disciples, Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, they say to him, "When shall these things be? What shall be the signs of your coming and of the end of the age?" And Jesus says, "Take heed that no man deceive you." And so, prophecy helps. There's going to be a lot of deception. There is a lot of deception in this world, but it's something that I think will snowball, and we'll see more and more as time goes on. Revelation chapter 20, about the millennium, is one that people have very different views or understandings on. Most of Christianity believe that this 1,000-year period, that God's people, the just, will be on the earth. And so we're going to go verse by verse and see that this is not the case, and talk about how that can become a problem. Where I would like to start is, I'm going to start in Revelation chapter 12 and 13. Okay, I'm going to show a little recording of something that I typed up on the computer. But keep in mind that Revelation is a series of timelines, just like Daniel is a series of timelines. We're going to go back to Daniel in another video, but what we should do is look at these timelines and try to grab what happens at the end of these timelines, because I think that they point to a lot of things that are misunderstood. So Revelation chapter 1, starts with John having this vision of Christ in the temple. He's standing in the midst of the candlesticks. It's kind of a progression in time, which we could spend a lot more talking about that. Revelation chapter 2 and 3 are the seven churches. So it starts with the apostolic movement, the cross, really in the church of Ephesus, and it comes down to the end of time. So we know that this is, both literal. This was a message that were to these churches specifically, but it's also applicable to us. And that's another study in itself. It comes down to the church of Laodicea, which I believe most of us believe that we are in that state. And we'll come back to that. When you look at the seven trumpets, the seven seals, you can see that they are timelines. But where I would like to start is Revelation chapter 12. I'm going to record the screen right here. And so here what I did was I just, wrote down the chapters. And what I'm trying to do is get an understanding of time. So let me explain this. Here at the beginning of chapter 12, it starts with, Michael and his angels fought against Satan and his angels. And it continues on through chapter 13. Chapter 13 has the beast of the sea, which we know is a parallel to what we see in Daniel chapter 7. Then it continues with the beast of the earth. Again, a progression in time. Chapter 13 ends with the mark of the beast crisis. So at the end of this timeline, right here, what I'm doing is, it ends with the mark of the beast crisis. When you go to 14, you can also see the mark of the beast crisis right here. It's somewhere in the middle of this. It's the three angels' messages, and the mark of the beast crisis begins at the third angel, and then shortly after that is the second coming of Christ. Chapters 15 and 16 kind of begins with the mark of the beast crisis, which the plagues follow after that, and then is the second coming of Christ. Then I have here chapter 19, which we're going to spend a lot of time on. We're going to read this verse by verse. This is just the second coming of Christ, which happens after the plagues. And here in chapter 20, it's the 1,000-year period that happens after the second coming of Christ. And then chapter 21 is the new heaven and the new earth. And yeah, we'll come back to that in a little bit. Okay. So that's just a summary of what we're going to be covering. So if we go back to Revelation chapter 12, as I mentioned, when we see this timeline, it ends with Revelation 13, verse 16. And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads. Okay, and I don't have to read the rest. This is the mark of the beast crisis, as I was trying to point out in this little graph that I have here. So here again ends with the mark of the beast crisis. When we come to chapter 14, you can see that it starts with the 144,000 that learn a new song, and then you have the three angels' messages. Well, the mark of the beast crisis is found in verse 9, right? The third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if any man worship the beast and his image, and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God. And so, it kind of, again, here we have this little progression of time. We have the mark of the beast crisis, and then shortly after this, in verse 14, is the second coming of Christ. But something that I should just make a little note of, often that, we see a lot of videos about the mark of the beast, whether it's a tattoo on the forehead or a chip or, a lot of different ideas that seem to circulate. And often we don't take into account that it's the third angel's message. And I think it would be appropriate for people to, to see more studies online of people emphasizing what is the first angel's message, what is the second angel's message, and put this in its time frame and in its context. But here on this, what I typed out here, the mark of the beast crisis happens sometime in the middle, as you can see, of this of chapter 14. It starts with the first angel's message, to fear God, to give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come. And so it starts with the commencement of the judgment, then really the proclamation that Babylon has fallen, and then the third angel's message of the mark of the beast. Then after this comes the second coming of Christ. Okay, and that's something that I would like to spend a couple minutes on. So let's go to Revelation 14 and verse 14. And I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and upon the cloud one sat like unto the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. There's a few things that we need to take note of here. One is that he comes in a cloud. He has a crown on his head, and he has a sickle. We're going to return to all of these. But, we are caught up into the clouds with Christ. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 16. Again, we'll read that a little bit later. And we're going to see in chapter 19, this is the same concept. He has a crown on his head. Well, he has a crown on his head because he is now king. He's King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Again, we'll see this parallel in Revelation chapter 19. But before this, Christ is not king, okay? In Revelation chapter 1, verse 5, he's referred to as the Prince of the Kings of the earth, okay? Before he comes as king, he is our high priest, right? So he's mediating between us and his Father, between us and God. And you cannot be, judge and mediator at the same time. Okay? And some people just haven't really thought about that. It's an easy thing to pass over. But Christ now is interceding for us. And when he comes, he will be crowned King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He is not yet, at this point, the judge. The judge is his Father. When you read Daniel chapter 7, when the Ancient of Days comes and the books are opened, the context here is the Father, and then Christ comes before the Ancient of Days. Okay, but we'll come to that in another video. So comes in the clouds. He has a crown on his head, meaning that he is now coming not so much as Savior, but as judge, to judge and wage war. Okay, we're going to read that verse in chapter 19. He comes with a sharp sickle. Okay, what is the sickle? It's for the harvest. And what do you do with the harvest? You take the first fruits. The first fruits go to God. That which is left does not go to God. And that's why if you read chapter 14, you see this distinction that the first fruits are taken. That which is left, if you read verse 19, and the angel thrust in his sickle into the earth and gathered the vine of the earth and cast it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And so you want to be the first fruits. We are referred to as the first fruits in James chapter 1, verse 18. And of course, Christ is the first fruits. Okay, so we'll just keep going and then we'll come back to this because, again, when we go to chapter 19, we'll kind of hit on it verse by verse, and a lot of this stuff will come up again. Next is chapter 15 and 16. And the mark of the beast crisis is here in 15 verse 2. So it's like right at the beginning. And shortly after this occur the plagues, okay, which you can press pause and read if you'd like. But again, I'm just doing a quick overview. So 15, mark of the beast crisis, and then 16, the plagues begin to fall on the earth. In order to understand the plagues better, it's good to parallel them with the trumpets. They're the same. You'll see parallels in each of them. When you come down to verse 17, okay, the seventh plague, it says the seventh vial. It says here in verse 17, and the seventh angel poured out his vial into the air, and there came a great voice out of the temple of heaven from the throne saying, "It is done." So here the Father in heaven is saying, "It is done." Verse 18, and there were voices and thunders and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such as was not since men were upon the earth. This earthquake, we're going to find, is paralleled to the first resurrection, okay, when Christ comes and his people are resurrected. This is paralleled with the earthquake that occurred at the cross when Christ had a select few that were resurrected to be witnesses. And it's just a concept that we see. It's also repeated in the seventh trumpet of Revelation in chapter 11. But I don't want to spend too much time here. When you come to chapter 17, it's not so much a timeline, it's just describing this system, Mystery Babylon the Great. And then when you come to chapter 18, it talks about Babylon, Babylon has fallen, which immediately precedes the second coming of Christ, because as we come to chapter 19, here's where we are at the second coming of Christ. So, chapter 19. I'm going to turn this off. What I'd like to do in chapter 19 is I'd like to start with verse 7, okay, and then, you'll see. So, verse 7 says, this again, we're in Revelation chapter 19, verse 7. Let us be glad and rejoice and give honor to him, for the marriage of the Lamb is come, and his wife hath made herself ready. Okay, I want to skip to verse 9. Just skip verse 8. I want to go to verse 9 just to make a point. And he saith unto me, right, blessed are they which are called unto the marriage supper of the Lamb. These are the true sayings of God. So as you can see in verse 7 and verse 9, it's talking about the marriage of the Lamb, or the marriage supper of the Lamb. We'll cover this a little bit more at another time, because we're going to go over a lot of verses, but this parallels what we find in Matthew chapter 22, the 10 virgins of Matthew 25, and it's here and there it's mentioned in Luke and elsewhere. But I want to keep this in mind. We are called to the marriage supper of the Lamb. Okay, and so where is this wedding being held? Okay, we'll kind of get to that as we get to more description of the New Jerusalem in chapter 21. Let's start in verse 11, and then we'll go from starting in verse 11. We're going to go verse by verse and kind of see what we can pull apart from here. Revelation 19, verse 11. And I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat upon him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he doth judge and make war. Okay, this is what he comes. He comes to judge and make war. Remember, he's come now crowned with a sickle in his hand in the clouds. Okay, but verse 12. His eyes were as a flame of fire, and on his head were many crowns. and he had a name written that no man knew but himself. And he was clothed with a vesture dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. And the armies which were in heaven followed him upon white horses, clothed in fine linen, white and clean. And out of his mouth goeth a sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. And he treadeth the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God. Okay, well, let me just read this, verse 16. And he hath on his vesture and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So we already mentioned this. In chapter 14, verse 14, Christ, it's a description of the second coming, and Christ comes crowned. Okay, and this is, as it says here, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. When you read the description of the angel with the rainbow above his head in Daniel 10, verse 1, you know, this is Christ as well. And why is a rainbow above his head? Because he's the Prince of the Covenant. Okay, this is not a crown at that point in this prophetic timeline. And as we already mentioned in Revelation 1:5, he's the Prince of the Kings of the earth. But here in chapter 19, he's coming in the fierceness and wrath of God Almighty, and as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. As it said over here, he comes to judge and make war. And he goes that he should smite the nations and rule them with a rod of iron. Okay, so this is, you know, this is just a very great picture that is being painted. And this is actually being taken from Psalm chapter 2, verse 6. When you read Psalm chapter 2, verse 6, it reads, and this is the Father speaking, Yet have I set my King upon my holy hill of Zion. I will declare the decree. The Lord hath said unto me, Thou art my son. This day have I begotten thee. Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron. Thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel, etc. So if you continue reading, there's a lot here in Psalm to grab from. But obviously this verse in Revelation 19, verse 15, is really, it's taken almost word for word. John is quoting Psalm 2, verse 6 and onward. Okay. And so Christ here, he's coming to judge. Okay, he's coming to judge at this point. Verse 17, And I saw an angel standing in the sun, and he cried with a loud voice, saying to all the fowls, the birds that fly in the midst of heaven, Come and gather yourselves together unto the supper of the great God. Okay. That you may eat, the birds, that you may eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses, and of them that sit on them, and the flesh of all men, both free and bond, both small and great. Okay, this is a powerful picture. Okay, and when we read verses 19 through 21, it's just repeating what we just read. Okay, now remember, when Christ comes in the cloud with the crown on his head and with his sickle, he takes the first fruits, okay, and then what is left on the earth are the unjust. And so what happens here to the unjust? Well, essentially, they are destroyed by the brightness of his coming. 2 Thessalonians 2:8. And so, you know, here we have, you know, God, they're calling all the birds that they may eat the flesh of kings and of captains and of mighty men, etc. Let's read 19 through 21, and we'll see that it's just talking about this that we just covered in verses 17 and 18. And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him that sat on the horse and against his army. Verse 20. And the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before him, with which he deceived them that had received the mark of the beast, and them that worshipped his image, both were cast alive into the lake of fire burning with brimstone. And the remnant, this is verse 21, which remnant? Is it us? No. The remnant, those that were left, were slain with the sword of him that sat upon the horse, which sword proceedeth out of his mouth, and all the fowls were filled with their flesh. So the remnant here, okay, it's very clear, are the unjust as well. Everyone that's left on the earth here is, it's either you're for God or against him. And at this point, God's people have been already taken up into the clouds, as is outlined in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 16. We'll read that. But, here, it's just, we're being given an image of complete destruction, of complete desolation. The plagues have occurred. The earth has been destroyed. We'll read a lot of parallel texts that talk about exactly this. Okay. When you read, Matthew 24, for example, the Olivet Discourse, and when Christ talks about the events that occur right before his coming, okay, the sun, the stars, they don't give their light. It's a pretty dark picture, everything that happens before the second coming of Christ. Okay. What I'd like to do now is jump to Jeremiah 25, okay, and I think it's 32. Jeremiah 25, verse 32 and 33. It says, "Thus saith the Lord of hosts, Behold, evil shall go forth from nation to nation, and a great whirlwind shall be raised up from the coasts of the earth. And the slain of the Lord shall be at that day from one end of the earth, even unto the other end of the earth. They shall not be lamented, neither gathered, nor buried. They shall be as dung upon the ground." So, this is not a proof text. We'll go to some more texts after this. But it does say that slain will be from one end of the earth unto the other, and that they will not be lamented, gathered, nor buried. Why? Because there's nobody there to lament, there's no one there to gather them, and there's no one there to bury them. Okay, the earth has already, we've already been resurrected at that point and taken into the clouds with Christ. Now remember, everything here has been left desolate. Jeremiah 4 and verse 23. "I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void, and the heavens, and they had no light." Okay, the earth is without form and void. Okay, so one would think, this is talking about creation, about before man was created, and no, this is after the coming of Christ. Verse 24. "I beheld the mountains, and lo, they trembled, and all the hills moved lightly. I beheld, and lo, there was no man, and all the birds of the heavens were fled." Well, remember, it said that the birds were called to the great feast to eat the flesh of men. Well, when there's nothing left, the birds leave, right? So it says here, there was no man, and all the birds of the heavens were fled. Okay, the birds left. Why did they leave? Because there's nothing left. Verse 26, "I beheld, and lo, the fruitful place was a wilderness." Again, this is not the beginning of time. This is after the coming of Christ. "All the cities thereof were broken down at the presence of the Lord." When else has the presence of the Lord left everything desolate? "And by his fierce anger." Well, we just read that in Psalm chapter 2, verse 6, and Revelation chapter 19. "For thus saith the Lord, the whole land shall be desolate, yet will I not make a full end." So this is a promise. Everything that God says is a promise. He says the whole land will be, future tense, desolate. And that has not occurred yet. When is it going to occur? But then it says, "Yet will I not make a full end." Okay. Let's jump back to Revelation chapter 20. And I'm going to press pause really quick to say hi to him. Hey. All right, we're back. What I want to do is just read the first verse, or the first few verses of Revelation 20. Okay, and then we're gonna comment a little bit on what we read in Jeremiah. We're going to go to the book of Isaiah. So Revelation 20, verse 1, it says, "I saw an angel come down from heaven, having the key of the bottomless pit, and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent which is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years, and cast him into the bottomless pit, and shut him up, and set a seal upon him, that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled. And after that, he must be loosed a little season." You're going to have to read this section over and over again, because it kind of repeats itself multiple times. And so hopefully we can kind of break this apart. But notice in verse 1 and 3 how it talks about the bottomless pit. Okay, the word there, and I'm not a Greek scholar, we just read and you find things. The word there is abusos, or abyss, okay? And so in the Septuagint Bible, Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, when it says that the earth was without form and void, and darkness, was on the face of the deep. The word there is abusos, or abyss. It's using the same word. And so the earth, in its primitive form in Genesis, is described as the abyss. And here, you just have all of this desolation that's occurred in Revelation chapter 19. And again, it's being referred to as the abyss. It's just using the same language. We saw that when we just read Jeremiah 4, verse 23. It says, I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void. Okay, so I think it's pretty evident what it's doing. Let's do something. Let's read Isaiah 24, okay? And starting in verse 1, and then we'll go back to Revelation chapter 20. And later I'll repeat all of these places that I want you guys to read or to keep in mind. I'll say it right now really fast so you can write it down if you're taking notes. So Revelation chapter 19 through 21, where it talks about the millennium, okay? This is spoken about as we already mentioned here, in Jeremiah chapter 4, starting in verse 23. It's also in Isaiah 24, chapter 25, and chapter 26, where it talks about, it's really, really deep if you want to spend time reading this, but it's Isaiah chapter 24 through chapter 26. Also reading Ezekiel chapter 37 through 40, also talks about this time frame. And if you want to be very brave, you can go ahead and jump into Zechariah chapter 14. But it took me a while to understand that. It's really, it's some deep stuff right there. But let's go here to Isaiah 24, verse 1. Behold, the Lord maketh the earth empty. Okay, again, and maketh it waste, and turneth it upside down, and scattereth abroad the inhabitants thereof. Okay, so there were inhabitants, but now there are no more inhabitants. He has made the earth empty. When does this apply in history? Okay, verse 2 I'm going to skip because it's just long and it repeats itself, and you could read it. Verse 3, the land shall be utterly emptied and utterly spoiled, for the Lord hath spoken this word. The earth mourneth and fadeth away, the world languisheth and fadeth away. The haughty people of the earth do languish. The earth also is defiled under the inhabitants thereof, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, broken the everlasting covenant. Okay, verse 6. Therefore hath the curse devoured the earth, and they that dwell therein are desolate. Okay, therefore the inhabitants of the earth are burned. Okay, and then it says, and few men left. These few men left are not men that are on the earth. Okay, think about this verse. It says here, the inhabitants of the earth are burned. Okay, the curse devoured the earth, and they that dwell therein are desolate. Those that dwell on the earth are desolate. They're burned up. The inhabitants of the earth are burned. Okay, period. The earth is desolate, and few men are left. So as the disciples, when they came to Christ, are there few that be in the kingdom? And so, here's pointing back to that. This is for another time, but if you continue reading chapters 25 and 26, there are, little hints here, and you can see the outline of this millennium and of the judgment that is to come. Okay. So for example, just because I'm here, let's say Isaiah 24 verse 20, the earth shall reel to and fro like a drunkard, and shall be removed like a cottage. So it has this description of really desolation. Verse 22, this will be more understood when we finish reading chapter 20. It says, and they shall be gathered as prisoners are gathered in the pit, and shall be shut up in the prison, and after many days they shall be visited. Okay, this is the battle of Gog and Magog. We'll come back to that. There's a lot of things here. Here you have in chapter 25, verse 8, that's something that's going to be repeated when we read the beginning of chapter 21 of Revelation. Also, Isaiah 26, 1 through 4. I'm going to read it. But this is a description of the New Jerusalem, which we will see paralleled in Revelation chapter 21. In that day shall this song be sung in the land of Judah. We have a strong city. Salvation will God appoint for walls and bulwarks. Open you the gates, that the righteous nation, which keepeth the truth, may enter in. Though thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee, because he trusteth in thee. Trust you in the Lord forever, for in the Lord Jehovah is everlasting strength. Again, the more that you read this, the more you're going to see these parallels. And even beforehand, for those that want to read Isaiah 23, the burden of Tyre, and then in verse 5, the report concerning Egypt. We're going to cover that at a later time and talk about the parallelism that is found with these verses. You know that the Egypt is often referred to as the world, or worldliness. I'm tongue-tied. Okay. So we were reading Revelation chapter 20, 1 through 3. And here it specifies that Satan is going to be on the earth, on a desolate earth, as a prisoner. Why? Because he has no one there to pester. He has no one there to tempt. And it says in verse 3, it says here that he should deceive the nations no more till the 1,000 years be fulfilled. Why? Because the second resurrection is not until the 1,000 years are over. We're going to see that in the next few verses. And after that, he must be loosed a little season. Well, after the second resurrection, the unjust are raised, and there's a short amount of time that they have to gather for the battle of Gog and Magog. Again, we'll get to this, but just trying to help you along to see what these verses are pointing to. When you read verse 4 kind of takes us in a whole different direction. Okay, it's, remember that the first fruits, that the righteous were taken up in the clouds, and this is just a verse that talks just about the righteous and not about what's happening on the earth. Let's go to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 16. Of course, many of us are familiar with this verse, but it's just, so we can hear it in its context. For the Lord himself, again I said 1 Thessalonians 4:16. For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout. Okay, we just read that. With the voice of the archangel and with the trump of God. And the dead in Christ shall rise first. Well, they are the first fruits, so they're going to be harvested first. Okay. And then it says here in verse 17, then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so shall we ever be with the Lord. Okay, so they are taken up into the clouds, and the righteous are taken up into the clouds. And who is left? The unjust, who are destroyed at the brightness of his coming, of Christ's coming. We can talk about that more, because that in itself, I'd like to point out some things that we have, our mind has automatic assumptions about, but I don't want to go into a tangent, but there's good material there. So we are caught up in the clouds with Christ. Where are we taken when we are caught up in the clouds with Christ? Because it says here at the end of verse 17, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. Well, if we will forever be with the Lord after the resurrection, where are we taken? And that's a fair question. Go to John 14, and we'll start in verse 1. It says, let not your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. Where is Christ going to prepare a place for us? In his Father's house. This is not on earth. This is in heaven. And we're going to see this more as we go along. If I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again. That's the second coming. And receive you unto myself. He takes us up into the clouds. That where I am, there you may be also. That's how the verse ended in 1 Thessalonians 4:17, that we will forever be with the Lord. And so we are taken to heaven, and the earth at that point lays desolate. There are more verses, but we will continue. Let's go to Revelation chapter 20 and read verse 4. And I saw thrones, and they sat upon them, and judgment was given to them. Okay, who is sitting on the thrones in this picture? It's the righteous, it's the just. Okay, it's those that were resurrected or that were taken. That's further clarified when you read Revelation chapter 3. I think it's verse 21. So remember that this is, a timeline of the 7 churches, and here you have the end of the church of Laodicea. This is the end of time. And it says in Revelation 3:21, "To him that overcometh will I grant to sit with me in my throne, even as I overcame and am set down with my Father in his throne." And so there it's the saints who are sitting on the throne. And then we'll continue with verse 4, and it says, "Judgment was given to them." Okay, and for that we'll read First Corinthians 6:2 and 3. "Do you not know that the saints shall judge the world? And if the world shall be judged by you, are you unworthy to judge the smallest matters? Know you not that you will judge angels? How much more things that pertain to this life?" And so, I hope it's obvious that right before this, okay, judgment has already taken place. The wheat and the tares have already been separated. The sheep and the goats have already been separated. Christ came to take the first fruits, and the unjust have been destroyed. Okay, and so what we are doing here in 20, it's not that we pass judgment on people, but we are reviewing the books there's so many Bible verses that talk about the record books in heaven. And we get to look at the books, and we get to see that all of the actions that God has taken are just. And so that in that sense, judgment was given to them. And so we'll continue in Revelation 20, verse 4, and it says, "And I saw the souls of them that were beheaded for the witness of Jesus and for the word of God, and which had not worshipped the beast, neither his image, neither had received his mark upon their foreheads or in their hands. And they lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. But the rest of the dead lived not until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection." What is the first resurrection? It's not the dead that lived not again for 1,000 years. It's the sentence that was mentioned right before that, where it says that they lived and reigned, the righteous lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. This is the first resurrection. Okay. In John chapter 5, I think it's verse 28, it talks about the resurrection of the righteous and the resurrection of damnation, or the unjust. Okay, and so there's 2 resurrections. So this obviously, it's the first resurrection that we see in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 16, and what we see outlined here is the resurrection of the righteous. But then it says, "The rest of the dead," verse 5, "the rest of the dead lived not again until the 1,000 years were finished." Right? Well, we just saw that in verse 3. At the end of 3, it says that Satan would not deceive the nations till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled. Why does Satan, why is he loosed out of his prison when the 1,000 years are fulfilled? Because the unjust, okay, are the resurrection of damnation. The unjust are resurrected. And so Satan now has people to, again, to tempt and to influence, I should say. Verse 6, "Blessed and holy is he that hath part in the first resurrection. On such the second death hath no power. But they shall be priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him 1,000 years." So it just repeated itself. But notice it said that those that are take part in the first resurrection, that the second death hath no power. Well, that means that the second death has power on those that are raised in the second resurrection, those that are raised after the 1,000 years. Okay, They are raised to condemnation, to damnation. Verse 7, and when the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison, and shall go out to deceive the nations which are in the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog. So remember, at the end of chapter 19, everyone was slain, right? And that the birds were eating the flesh of those that were slain. And then in Jeremiah, chapter 25, and in chapter 4, it said that there was no man left and that the birds fled. Why? Because nothing is left. Well, the earth lays desolate and the bodies have now decomposed into the earth. And now you have this second resurrection. Those that had died at the end of Revelation, of Revelation chapter 19, are now being resurrected. And Satan once again gets to influence them and gathers them to battle. It says the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea. So verse 9, and they went up on the breadth of the earth, and compassed the camp of the saints about, and the beloved city, and fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. So as we can see, the unrighteous are on the earth, okay, and the righteous are with Christ and with his Father in the New Jerusalem that is coming down from heaven, which we'll see in chapter 21. It says here, chapter 21, verse 2, it says that the New Jerusalem coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. Well, remember we were called to the wedding banquet in Revelation 19, verses 7 and 9. And so where is this wedding banquet? Okay, it's in heaven. It's in the New Jerusalem. That does not come down until after this 1,000-year period. Going back to Revelation chapter 20, verse 10. And the devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and shall be tormented day and night forever and ever. Okay. Verse 11. And I saw a great white throne, and him that sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away. There was found no more place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God, and the books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books, according to their works. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and hell delivered up the dead which were in them, and they were judged every man according to their works. And death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. Okay. So it mentions the second death, right? We saw that in chapter 20, verse 6. Blessed and holy is he that hath part in the first resurrection. On such, the second death has no power. So the unrighteous, right, the unrighteous that are raised again in the second resurrection are only raised again to receive their judgment and to experience the second death. Verse 15, and whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. Let's read the first few verses here of 21, and we'll call it a day. So Revelation chapter 21, verse 1, and I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride, adorned for her husband. And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men. He will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. So the tabernacle of God has now come down upon the earth, and as it says here, as a bride adorned for her husband. And it says in verse 4, God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying, and there shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. So, in context, this occurs after this 1,000-year period, that the new earth and the new heavens are created. When we go to Isaiah chapter 65, we see this same thing happen. Isaiah 65, and we'll start in verse 17. For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former shall not be remembered, nor come into mind. But be glad and rejoice forever in that which I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem a rejoicing, and her people a joy. I will rejoice in Jerusalem, and joy in my people. And the voice of weeping shall be no more, which we just read in Revelation 21. It says here, the weeping shall be no more heard in her, nor the voice of crying. If you continue to read, there are some really good pieces of gold that are in this area. Let's skip over to Isaiah 66, verse 22. For as the new heavens and the new earth, which I will make, shall remain before me, saith the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain. Verse 23. And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord. And so once this, once this 7,000 year period is complete, and the new heavens and the new earth are created, all things are going to go back to how they were in Eden. In Eden, Adam and Eve, I'm sure that it says that they acknowledged and they worshiped God from one Sabbath to another. And I'm sure from one new moon to another. These are just measures of time. We will be living in eternity, but that doesn't mean that there won't be, keeping of time. And so when we have one new moon to another, that's a monthly cycle. And when you have one Sabbath to another, that's a weekly cycle. So I think that's a good place to stop for now. Let's give a little summary, right? So Revelation 19 through 21 talks about the second coming of Christ, this 1,000 year period, and then, the judgment of the unjust, the second death, and in chapter 21, the new earth and the new heavens created. Okay, and we see this paralleled when we read Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 23. Also in chapter 25, it talks about the earth being desolate. Isaiah chapter 24, chapter 25, chapter 26. Ezekiel, we didn't go to that, but Ezekiel 37, the dry bones, and then 38, 39, and then 40 talks about this vision of the temple, is also a parallel to what we see here. And Zechariah 14. These chapters I would enjoy going into further detail. The reason why I think that this is important is because many people today believe that, most of Christianity believes that once Christ comes, at his second coming, that we will inherit the earth at that point, okay? Where I'm saying that we inherit the earth after the 1,000 years and after the earth is made new. Because if we're given the earth after Christ comes, everything is burnt up, everything's destroyed. Mountains fled, there were great earthquakes such as never was, etc. Not only is there desolation of life, but the earth is itself destroyed. But what many believe is that Christ will come and that he will institute his theocracy, his law on this earth, a law of love. And that, we will have time to get with the program. But if we don't get with the program, you better listen or else. And I've heard people say that on videos online, and you say, well, what's going to happen if people don't get along with the program, if they don't accept this message of Christ, what's going to happen? Well, the only conclusion is that they're going to be killed. What else is going to happen if Christ comes and someone says, I don't care what you say or how nice you are, I'm not listening? Well, just the logical conclusion is that they are either put to death. Well, they would have to be put to death. The problem with this is that God does not force worship on anyone. And if people believe that Christ will come and institute a theocracy on an earth, and that people will have a second chance, but if they don't accept that second chance, they're done away with, that's making man judge over man, because man is going to start to control the actions of others. I don't know if that makes any sense. Whereas if Satan comes, remember he was a glorious angel, if Satan comes impersonating Christ, and he looks lovely and speaks lovely and tells everyone, this is the theocracy that I'm going to set up on the earth. Remember that Satan was subtle as the serpent. then most of the world is going to be deceived because they already believe that Christ is coming to set up a theocracy on the earth, and that's exactly what they're going to see happen. And so they're going to follow Satan, essentially, and they're going to listen to Satan, and then that small few that do not get with the program are going to be persecuted, just as Christ was persecuted. But his people will be persecuted not for doing any wrong, but just because they hold to the Word of God. Again, the more that you read this, the more that this will become clear, the more that you discuss it, the more it will become clear, and I could spend more time elaborating on this, but I think you guys get the picture, and we'll just wait until next time to read things a little bit further.